The mud swallowed Alina Davy's boots with each desperate step, the swollen river having already consumed her home, her livestock, and the last of her flour. Rain pelted her face as she clutched a sodden bundle of belongings to her chest, the only possessions she'd managed to salvage before the waters rose. The Great Flood of 1874 had transformed the peaceful valley around Douglas, Colorado, into a watery graveyard of dreams. Delilah Ellis Dell, to most who knew her, had come west with her father 3 years prior, filled with hopes of independence and prosperity. At 22, she had already weathered more than her fair share of hardship. Her mother had passed when Dell was 16, and her father's consumption had taken him last winter, leaving her to manage their small homestead alone. She had been doing well enough, proud of her self-sufficiency, until the skies opened and refused to close for 14 days straight. "Come on, Marigold," Dell coaxed her exhausted mare, the only animal that hadn't been swept away. The horse trudged forward, as weary and drenched as her owner. "We'll find somewhere, we have to." Night was falling fast, and with it the temperature. April in Colorado territory could be merciless, and Dell knew that without shelter, the cold would claim her as surely as the flood had claimed her home. Her stomach growled painfully, a reminder that she hadn't eaten since yesterday's meager breakfast, the last of her stores. The rain finally began to slacken as Dell crested a rise. In the valley below, golden lamplight shone from the windows of a sturdy ranch house. Beyond it, she could make out the silhouettes of a barn and several outbuildings, all standing intact on higher ground that the floodwaters hadn't reached. Hope fluttered in her chest, but pride made her hesitate. Dell Ellis had never begged, but she was out of options. She urged Marigold down the slope, each step bringing her closer to potential salvation or rejection. The ranch was well kept someone's pride and joy. A large corral housed several horses, and smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. As Dell approached, a tall figure emerged from the barn, shotgun in hand. "That's far enough, stranger," a deep voice called out. Dell reined in Marigold, raising her hands to show she meant no harm. "Please," she called, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "I've lost everything in the flood. I just need a place to rest my horse and myself for the night." The figure stepped closer, and Dell could see it was a man in his late 20s or early 30s. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but she could feel his eyes assessing her. "Where are you from?" he asked, not lowering the shotgun. "My homestead was about 10 miles east, near Beaver Creek, the flood." She couldn't finish the sentence as emotion suddenly threatened to overwhelm her. The man was close enough now that Dell could make out his features, a strong jaw dusted with stubble, keen eyes that seemed to look straight through her, and broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard work. His clothes were worn but clean, his manner wary but not unkind. "Quincy Galloway," he said finally, lowering his weapon. "This is the Double G Ranch." His eyes traveled from her mud-splattered form to the exhausted mare. "You look half drowned, and that horse needs tending." Dell straightened her spine. "I'm Delilah Ellis, Dell. I don't mean to impose, but the flood took your bread and your hope," he said, his voice gentler now. "Well, Miss Ellis, you'll eat at my table tonight." Relief washed over Dell, nearly buckling her knees. "Thank you, Mr. Galloway." "I won't be a burden. Let's get you and your horse out of this weather," he said, reaching for Marigold's reins. "The worst of the rain's passed, but we're not done with this storm yet." He led them toward the barn, and Dell followed, grateful for the promise of shelter. Inside, the barn was warm and dry, the sweet smell of hay a welcome change from the sodden world outside. "You can leave your horse here," Quincy said, gesturing to an empty stall. "I'll get her dried off and fed. You head on up to the house, doors unlocked. My housekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, will get you sorted with dry clothes and something hot to drink." Dell hesitated. "I can tend to Marigold myself. She's all I have left." Something like respect flickered in Quincy's eyes. "As you wish. I'll help, then we'll both head up to the house. Mrs. Peterson always makes enough food for an army anyway." Together they removed Marigold's saddle and rubbed the tired mare down with clean straw. Quincy provided fresh hay and a measure of oats, which the horse fell upon gratefully. "She's a good animal," Quincy observed. strong legs. Good conformation. She was my father's pride, Dell said, patting the mare's neck. She carried me through water up to her chest today. Quincy nodded approvingly. She's earned her rest then, as have you. They walked to the house in companionable silence. Dell couldn't help but notice how Quincy positioned himself between her and the worst of the wind, or how he subtly offered his arm when they reached a particularly muddy patch. Such small courtesies had been absent from her life for so long that they felt almost foreign. The main house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a solid two-story structure built of sturdy pine logs with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Inside, warmth and light greeted them, along with the mouth-watering aroma of cooking food. Mrs. Peterson. Quincy called, helping Dell remove her sodden jacket. We've a guest. A plump woman with silver-streaked hair emerged from what Dell presumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of Dell's bedraggled appearance. Mercy, child. You look like something the river washed up, she shot Quincy an accusatory look. And you let the poor thing stand there dripping. Quincy Galloway, where are your manners? Quincy's lips twitched in amusement. Dell Ellis, meet Mrs. Harriet Peterson, who runs this house and everyone in it with an iron fist in a velvet glove. Mrs. Peterson huffed but couldn't hide her smile. Miss Ellis has lost her home to the flooding, Quincy explained. She'll be staying with us tonight. Well, of course she will, Mrs. Peterson said decisively, and longer if need be. No one should be out in such weather. She took Dell's arm. Come along, dear, let's get you into something dry before you catch your death. I've plenty that might fit you with a bit of pinning. Dell allowed herself to be led upstairs where Mrs. Peterson fussed over her like a mother hen, providing her with a warm nightgown, a thick woolen robe, and soft slippers. The older woman insisted on helping Dell wash the mud from her hair and face, all the while clucking sympathetically about the dreadful flood and how half the county's underwater. It's not just you, dear Mrs. Peterson said as she brushed out Dell's long chestnut hair before the fire in the guest room. The Wilsons lost their mill, and the Petersons, no relation to me, had their entire crop washed away. Even the road to town is gone in places. How bad is it? Dell asked, dreading the answer. Mrs. Peterson sighed. Worst flooding in 20 years, they're saying, but don't you fret about all that tonight. You're safe and dry, and that's what matters. When Dell finally descended the stairs, she found Quincy waiting in the dining room, freshly changed himself into dry clothes. He rose when she entered, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes that made Dell suddenly aware of how the borrowed nightgown and robe must look on her slight frame. You clean up well, Miss Ellis, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I trust Mrs. Peterson has made you comfortable. Very much so. She's been exceedingly kind. That she is, though don't tell her I said so. It would ruin her stern reputation. His smile was warm, transforming his weathered face into something decidedly handsome. Mrs. Peterson bustled in with a steaming tureen. Sit, both of you. The stew's ready, and there's fresh bread to go with it. Dell hadn't realized how desperately hungry she was until the first spoonful of rich venison stew hit her tongue. She tried to eat slowly, not wanting to appear greedy, but soon found herself accepting a second helping at Mrs. Peterson's insistence. The flood came so fast, Dell explained between bites of crusty bread. I was checking the chicken coop when I heard this roaring sound. By the time I got back to the house, water was already coming through the door. I grabbed what I could, some clothes, my father's pocket watch, the deed to the land, and got marigold from the barn. The water was rising so quickly. Her voice faltered as she remembered the terrifying rush of the floodwaters, how they'd swept away the chicken coop with all her hens still inside, how her small garden had disappeared beneath the muddy torrent. I tried to save some of the food stores, but everything happened so fast. The flour sacks were soaked through, the preserves smashed. She blinked back tears. I'd worked so hard to make that place prosper after Pa died. Quincy's expression was solemn. How long have you been running the homestead alone? Since December. Pa caught a chill that turned to consumption. He didn't last through the winter. And before that, we came out from Pennsylvania 3 years ago. Ma died back east and Pa thought a fresh start would do us good. Quincy nodded. That takes courage, both coming west and carrying on alone. Dell shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. It's what needed doing, that's all. Well, Mrs. Peterson said firmly, setting down a slice of apple pie in front of Dell, you're not alone tonight and that's something to be grateful for. Later, after Mrs. Peterson had retired for the night, Quincy and Dell sat before the fire in the cozy parlor. Rain pattered against the windows, but inside all was warm and secure. Dell found herself studying her host as he stared thoughtfully into the flames. Quincy Galloway was not what one might call classically handsome, but there was strength in his features, character etched by sun and wind and the challenges of frontier life. His hands were calloused, his forearms corded with muscle beneath rolled-up shirt sleeves. Yet there was gentleness, too, in the way he'd tended Marigold and in his quiet consideration for Dell's comfort. "You're staring, Miss Ellis," he said without looking away from the fire. Dell flushed. "I apologize, I was just thinking about how quickly life can change. Yesterday I had a home, plans for spring planting. Today I have nothing but what I could carry." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I don't even know if there's anything left to go back to." Quincy turned to face her then. "I'll ride out with you tomorrow once the waters recede a bit. We'll see what's left and what can be salvaged." "You don't have to do that, you've been kind enough already. It's what neighbors do," he said simply. Then, after a moment, "How big was your place?" 40 acres, most of it along the creek." She sighed. "The bottomland was good for growing, but I suppose that's the risk of farming in a floodplain." "You were working it alone, all 40 acres? Dell felt a flicker of defensiveness. "I managed. The crops were mostly for our own use, corn, beans, some wheat. I had chickens for eggs, a milk cow." Her voice caught as she remembered the cow's frightened lowing as the waters rose. She hadn't been able to untie the poor creature in time. Quincy seemed to sense her distress. "It's hard country for anyone alone, man or woman," he said quietly. "No shame in admitting that." Dell stared down at her hands. "What choice do I have? I can't afford hired help." "There are always choices, Miss Ellis." He rose and added another log to the fire. "But those are concerns for tomorrow. You should rest now. You've had a trying day." Dell nodded, suddenly aware of the bone-deep weariness that had settled over her. "Thank you again, Mr. Galloway, for everything." He inclined his head. "Sleep well, Miss Ellis. Tomorrow we'll see what can be done." Dell woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why she wasn't in her own bed. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back: the flood, the desperate ride through the rain, and Quincy Galloway's unexpected kindness. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now cleaned and dried by Mrs. Peterson's efficient hands, and made her way downstairs. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon greeted her, making her stomach growl appreciatively. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Peterson at the stove and Quincy seated at the table reading a newspaper. "Good morning," Dell said tentatively. Quincy looked up, a smile warming his face. "Miss Ellis, you're looking more rested." "I slept better than I had any right to, given the circumstances," she admitted. "Is there anything I can do to help with breakfast, Mrs. Peterson?" "You can sit yourself down and eat," the older woman replied, setting a plate laden with eggs, bacon, and biscuits before her. "You'll need your strength today." As Dell ate, Quincy outlined his plan. "I rode out at first light to check the creek levels. The water's going down, but slowly. We can make it to your homestead if we're careful." "We?" Dell questioned. "I'm coming with you," he said matter-of-factly. "And so is Tom Bradley, one of my ranch hands. We've loaded tools and supplies onto the wagon." "Mr. Galloway, while I appreciate the offer, I can't accept such charity." Quincy's expression remained impassive. "It's not charity, Miss Ellis, it's neighborliness. Besides, Bradley's been complaining of boredom with the spring roundup delayed by the weather. He'll welcome the diversion." Dell wanted to protest further, but she knew she would need help assessing the damage to her property. "Very well, but I insist on repaying you somehow." "We can discuss that later," Quincy said, rising from the table. We should get moving if we want to make the most of the daylight. An hour later, Dell found herself seated between Quincy and Tom Bradley on the bench of a sturdy wagon. Marigold was tied behind, seeming rejuvenated after a night of rest and good feed. Tom Bradley proved to be a taciturn man of about 50 with a weathered face and capable hands. He nodded politely when introduced, but otherwise kept his thoughts to himself. The journey to Dell's homestead took longer than usual, as they had to detour around washed-out sections of road and ford streams where bridges had been damaged. The devastation was apparent everywhere they looked, fields submerged under standing water, debris caught in tree branches showing how high the waters had risen, livestock carcasses bloating in the sun. "Lord have mercy," Tom muttered as they passed the remains of a neighbor's barn, its roof torn off and walls collapsed. Dell's anxiety grew with each mile. If the Hendersons' sturdy barn couldn't withstand the flood, what chance did her small cabin have? When they finally turned onto the rutted track that led to her property, Dell's worst fears were confirmed. Where her home had stood was now a jumble of logs and planks, half submerged in muddy water. The chicken coop was completely gone, as was the small shed that had housed her tools. Only the barn remained partially standing, its roof sagging dangerously. Dell pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting back tears. Quincy's hand settled briefly, reassuringly on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Miss Ellis," he said quietly. Dell forced herself to straighten her spine. "At least I got out alive, and Marigold too." She climbed down from the wagon before either man could help her, needing to see the destruction up close. The water had receded from its highest point but still pooled around what remained of her home. Navigating carefully through the mud, Dell approached the wreckage. A sob caught in her throat as she spotted her mother's quilt caught in a tangle of branches, torn and muddy beyond redemption. "Don't go any closer," Quincy warned, coming up beside her. "Those timbers aren't stable." Dell nodded numbly. "Everything's gone." "Not everything," Quincy said. He pointed to the rise where her father had established their small family cemetery. "The high ground held, and the barn structure might be salvageable, though the roof will need replacing." Tom Bradley had already waded toward the barn, assessing the damage with a professional eye. "Foundation's still good," he called. "Frame too, mostly. It's mainly the roof that took the beating." Dell tried to focus on these small mercies, but the loss felt overwhelming. 3 years of hard work and sacrifice swept away in a single day. "What will you do now?" Quincy asked gently. Dell shook her head. "I don't know. Rebuild, I suppose, though I've no money for lumber. Perhaps I can salvage enough." "Miss Ellis Dell," Quincy said, his use of her first name catching her attention. "Be practical. Even if you salvaged every usable board, you'd have nowhere near enough to rebuild, and with no livestock or seed for planting, how would you sustain yourself?" His words, though kindly meant, struck Dell like physical blows. "What would you have me do? Abandon my land? This is all I have." "You have options," he countered. "The land still has value even after the flood. You could sell it." "And go where? Do what?" Her voice rose with distress. "This is my home, Mr. Galloway." "No, Miss Ellis, this was your home," he said, gesturing to the wreckage. "Now it's a reminder of what you've lost. You're young, capable. You could start fresh somewhere less prone to flooding." Dell turned away, unwilling to let him see her tears. "Easy for you to say, with your fine ranch on high ground." She heard him sigh behind her. "I don't mean to be harsh, but I've seen what false hope can do to a person. Sometimes the wisest course is to recognize when it's time to move on." "Let's see what we can salvage first," she said, unwilling to discuss the matter further. "There may be things of value in the wreckage." They spent the rest of the day carefully picking through the debris. Tom Bradley managed to rescue Dell's cast iron cookware and a few metal tools from the mud. Quincy found her father's old trunk wedged against a tree, its contents soaked but potentially salvageable. Dell herself discovered a small leather pouch containing her mother's cameo and her father's pocket watch, miraculously protected by the oilskin wrapping. By late afternoon, the meager pile of recovered possessions stood in stark contrast to all that had been lost. Dell's spirits sank lower with each passing hour. "That's all we'll manage today," Quincy said finally. The light's fading and we should head back before the road becomes too treacherous. Dell looked around at the ruins of her life, reluctant to leave. I should stay, sleep in the barn, perhaps. The barn's not safe, Tom said bluntly. Roof could come down any time. Miss Ellis, Quincy added, there's nothing more to be done today. We can return tomorrow if you wish, but for now you need food and rest. Too exhausted to argue, Dell allowed herself to be led back to the wagon. The journey back to the Double G was made in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. That evening, after another of Mrs. Peterson's hearty meals, Dell found herself once again seated across from Quincy in the parlor. The events of the day had left her drained, empty of both tears and words. I've been thinking, Quincy said after they had sat in silence for some time. You're in need of work and a place to stay. I'm in need of someone to help Mrs. Peterson with the house and the garden. She's not as young as she once was, though she'd box my ears for saying so. Dell looked up, surprised. You're offering me employment? I am. Room, board, and wages, at least until you decide what you want to do about your land. Pride warred with practicality in Dell's mind. She had always prided herself on her independence, on needing no one. But now, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a handful of salvaged possessions, could she afford such pride? I wouldn't want to be a burden, she said hesitantly. You wouldn't be, Quincy assured her. Mrs. Peterson has been after me for months to hire help. The ranch keeps growing, and so do her responsibilities. It would be a fair exchange your labor for my hospitality. Dell considered the offer. It would give her time to think, to plan her next move without the pressure of immediate need. Very well, Mr. Galloway, I accept, at least temporarily. Relief flickered across his face. Good, that's settled then. He rose, as if eager to end the conversation before she could change her mind. Mrs. Peterson will be pleased. She's taken quite a shine to you. As Dell prepared for bed that night, she found herself wondering about her new employer. Quincy Galloway was something of a mystery, a successful rancher. Clearly, but unmarried and seemingly content with only Mrs. Peterson and his ranch hands for company. He was neither particularly handsome nor especially charming, yet there was something compelling about his quiet strength and direct manner. Not that it mattered, Dell reminded herself sternly. She was his employee now, nothing more. And her stay at the Double G was temporary, just long enough to get back on her feet and decide what to do with her waterlogged property. Still, as she drifted towards sleep, Dell couldn't help but remember the gentle pressure of Quincy's hand on her shoulder, offering comfort when words would have been inadequate. The days that followed settled into a routine. Dell rose early, helping Mrs. Peterson prepare breakfast for Quincy and the half-dozen ranch hands who worked the Double G. The men would ride out after eating, returning at midday for a quick meal before heading back to their duties. Dell spent her mornings cleaning, washing, and helping Mrs. Peterson with the endless tasks that kept the ranch house functioning smoothly. Afternoons found her in the kitchen garden, which had been Mrs. Peterson's pride, but had grown somewhat neglected as the older woman's arthritis worsened. Dell threw herself into the work, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of turning soil, planting seeds, and tending young plants. The garden responded to her care, expanding and flourishing under her attention. You certainly have a way with growing things, Quincy observed one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner. May had brought warmer weather, and the habit had developed of taking their coffee outside to enjoy the lengthening twilight. I've always loved gardening, Dell admitted. My mother taught me she could make anything grow, even in the poorest soil. You've done wonders with the kitchen garden. Mrs. Peterson says we'll have the earliest tomatoes in the county thanks to you. Dell felt a flush of pleasure at the praise. It's satisfying work, I've missed it. They fell into a companionable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. These quiet evening conversations had become a highlight of Dell's days. Quincy was not a talkative man by nature, but he was a good listener, and occasionally shared stories of his own journey west from Virginia as a young man of 18, determined to make his fortune in the expanding cattle business. Have you given any more thought to what you'll do about your land? He asked after a time. Dell sighed. They had made 2 more trips to her homestead since that first devastating visit. Each time, the reality of her loss had become clearer. The cabin was beyond repair, the soil along the creek still sodden and unsuitable for immediate planting. Even if she had the resources to rebuild, which she didn't, the sensible course would be to choose higher ground for a new dwelling. "I'm thinking of selling," she admitted, "but I don't know who would buy flooded land." "Land recovers," Quincy said thoughtfully. "In a year or 2, that bottomland will be as fertile as ever. Someone with the means to wait out the recovery might consider it a good investment." Dell nodded slowly. "Perhaps, but finding such a buyer won't be easy." Quincy took a sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "I might be interested. The Double G could use more grazing land for the expanding herd." Dell turned to look at him, surprised. "You would buy my property?" "For a fair price, yes. It adjoins my eastern boundary, and once the grass comes back, it would make good pasture." I would need to think about it," Dell said carefully. The idea of selling her father's land, the place where he was buried, felt like a betrayal. Yet she knew in her heart that she couldn't rebuild there alone. "Of course," Quincy said. "There's no rush, think it over." Later that night, as Dell lay in bed, she found herself wrestling with conflicting emotions. Selling to Quincy would be a practical solution to her dilemma. He would pay fairly, and she trusted him to respect her father's resting place. The money would give her options, perhaps enough to start fresh somewhere else. Yet the thought of leaving Douglas filled her with unexpected sadness. In the weeks since the flood, she had begun to feel at home at the Double G. Mrs. Peterson treated her like a daughter, and the ranch hands had accepted her presence with easy camaraderie. And then there was Quincy himself. Dell rolled over, punching her pillow in frustration. She would not allow herself to develop tender feelings for her employer. That way lay only complication and heartache. Quincy had offered her employment and now a business transaction, nothing more. His kindness was that of a decent man to someone in need, not special attention to her as a woman. With that stern reminder firmly in place, Dell finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. June arrived, bringing with it blooming wildflowers and long, sun-filled days. The Double G was busy with the early summer roundup, and Dell found herself preparing larger meals as additional hands were hired to help with the work. She rose before dawn each day and often didn't retire until well after sunset, but the exhaustion was satisfying rather than depleting. One evening, as Dell was hanging out laundry to take advantage of the last rays of sunlight, she heard the thunder of approaching hooves. Looking up, she saw Quincy riding hard toward the house, accompanied by 2 of his men. Even at a distance, she could tell something was wrong by the urgency of their pace. Dell hurried to the porch as they dismounted. Quincy's expression was grim, his shirt torn and bloodied at the shoulder. "What happened?" she gasped. "Rustlers," one of the ranch hands explained. "Hit the north pasture. Boss took a bullet when we ran them off." "It's nothing," Quincy said dismissively, though his face was pale with pain. "Bullet just grazed me." "Inside now," Dell ordered, her concern overriding her usual deference. "Mrs. Peterson, we need hot water and bandages." The older woman appeared in the doorway, took one look at Quincy, and bustled back inside to gather supplies. Dell led Quincy to the kitchen, where the light was best. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a chair, "and let me see how bad it is." Quincy complied without argument, a testament to how much the wound was paining him. Dell carefully helped him remove his shirt, trying to ignore the lean, muscled expanse of his chest and the numerous scars that told the story of a life lived hard on the frontier. The bullet had indeed grazed his shoulder, leaving a deep furrow that bled freely but didn't appear to have hit anything vital. Dell cleaned the wound with warm water, her touch as gentle as she could make it, despite Quincy's occasional hiss of pain. "You're lucky," she told him as she applied a poultice of herbs that Mrs. Peterson had prepared. "An inch to the left and you'd have lost the use of your arm." "Luck had little to do with it," Quincy said through gritted teeth. "I saw him aiming and moved, just not quite fast enough." Dell's hands faltered at the thought of how differently things might have ended. Did you recognize the rustlers? Quincy's expression darkened. Not with certainty, but I have my suspicions. The Taylor gang has been operating in these parts for months. The sheriff should be notified. Bradley's riding to town now, Quincy confirmed. Not that Sheriff Wilson will do much. He's more interested in his next bottle than in enforcing the law. Dell finished bandaging the wound and stepped back to inspect her work. You should rest. The wound isn't serious, but you've lost blood, and riding in this heat couldn't have helped. Quincy caught her wrist as she turned away. Thank you, he said simply. Dell was suddenly, acutely aware of his bare chest, of his strong fingers encircling her wrist, of how close they were standing. It was nothing, she murmured, gently extracting herself from his grip. Anyone would have done the same. Not everyone would have kept such a steady hand or shown such competence, he countered. You continue to surprise me, Miss Ellis. Before Dell could respond, Mrs. Peterson bustled back into the kitchen. Bed for you, Quincy Galloway. No arguments. You've given us all quite a scare. Quincy rose obediently, though he swayed slightly on his feet. Dell instinctively moved to his side, providing support. I can manage, he protested, but his pallor suggested otherwise. Of course you can, Dell said soothingly, but there's no harm in accepting help when it's offered. Your own wise words, as I recall. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Using my words against me, Miss Ellis, very well. He allowed her to help him to his room, where Mrs. Peterson had already turned down the covers. Call if you need anything, Dell said as she prepared to leave him to rest. Fever can follow even minor wounds if they're not kept clean. Quincy nodded, his eyes already heavy with exhaustion. I'll be fine by morning, don't fret. Dell returned to the kitchen to clean up, her mind troubled. The incident with the rustlers was a stark reminder of the dangers of frontier life. Men like the Taylors preyed on isolated ranches, stealing cattle and sometimes worse. The thought of what might have happened if Quincy hadn't spotted the ambush in time made her shudder. That night she checked on him twice, easing his door open to ensure he was resting comfortably. The second time she found him awake, staring at the ceiling. Can't sleep, she asked softly. He turned his head to look at her, shoulders throbbing, and my mind won't quiet. Dell entered the room fully, carrying the lamp she'd brought to light her way. I can make you a willow bark tea for the pain. No need, it will pass, he shifted, wincing slightly. What keeps you awake at this hour? Concern for a foolhardy employer who thinks he's invincible, she replied with gentle teasing. His laugh was soft in the dimness. Hardly invincible, just stubborn. That you are. Dell set the lamp on the bedside table and perched on the edge of a chair. Would you like me to read to you? My father always said a good story was the best medicine for a troubled mind. Quincy's expression softened at the offer. I'd like that. There's a book of Tennyson's poems in the drawer there. Dell found the volume, well-worn and clearly beloved. She opened it to a marked page and began to read in a low, soothing voice. The poetry filled the quiet room, creating an intimacy that felt both new and somehow familiar, as if they had shared such moments many times before. When Dell looked up after finishing the poem, she found Quincy watching her, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. You read beautifully, he said. Your father taught you well. He believed education was as important for daughters as for sons. Dell closed the book gently. He would have liked you, I think. Why do you say that? Dell considered the question. Because you're honorable, and because you've been kind to his daughter when she most needed kindness. Something shifted in Quincy's expression, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. It's easy to be kind to you, Dell. The use of her given name, rare from his lips, sent a flutter through her chest. You should rest, she said, rising quickly. It's late and you need to heal. Will you come back tomorrow night to read again? The request held a note of uncertainty that tugged at Dell's heart. If you wish it, she agreed, unable to refuse. I do wish it, very much. Dell nodded and retrieved her lamp. Good night then, Mr. Galloway. Quincy, he corrected softly. After all this time, I think you might call me Quincy. Good night, Quincy, she amended, the name feeling intimate on her tongue. Good night, Dell, sweet dreams. As she closed his door and made her way back to her own room, Dell acknowledged the truth she had been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling in love with Quincy Galloway, a man who saw her as an employee, perhaps a friend, but surely nothing more. The realization brought both joy and trepidation. Joy at the depth of feeling she was capable of, and trepidation at the inevitable heartache that would follow when the time came to leave the double G, for leave she must, eventually. No matter how at home she felt here, this was not her place. She was a paid helper, not family. And the longer she stayed, the harder it would be to establish her independence elsewhere. With that sobering thought, Dell returned to her room, though sleep remained elusive for many hours. True to his word, Quincy was up and about the next morning, though his movements were stiff, and his face drawn with pain he refused to acknowledge. He insisted on riding out with his men despite Mrs. Peterson's vocal objections and Dell's quieter concern. "The Taylors will be watching," he explained. "If I stay home nursing a scratch, they'll think the double G is vulnerable. And if you tear open that scratch and develop a fever, the double G will be vulnerable indeed," Dell countered, but Quincy merely smiled and rode out as planned. The reading sessions continued each evening, becoming a cherished ritual for them both. Dell would bring the Tennyson volume to Quincy's room after the house had settled for the night, and they would spend an hour or more with poetry and conversation. As the days passed and Quincy's shoulder healed, they might have returned to their previous routine of sitting on the porch, but neither suggested it. There was something special about these nighttime meetings, a private world where they could speak more freely than they did in the light of day. Dell learned more about Quincy during these sessions than she had in all the weeks prior. He told her of his childhood in Virginia, the son of a once prosperous family brought low by the war. How he had headed west at 18, worked as a cowhand on various ranches, saved every penny, and finally purchased the land that would become the double G when he was 25. It was nothing but a run-down cabin and a few hundred acres of neglected pasture then, he recalled. "Took 5 years of backbreaking work before I could afford to hire my first hand." "And now?" Dell asked, curious about the extent of his holdings. 20,000 acres, more or less, 800 head of cattle, 12 horses, 6 full-time hands more during roundup and branding. He shrugged as if the accomplishment was unremarkable. "It's a good living." "It's impressive," Dell corrected. "You've built something lasting, something to be proud of." Quincy looked at her thoughtfully. "Perhaps, but a ranch is more than land and livestock. It should be a home, a place where a family can thrive." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. Dell looked down at the book in her hands, afraid of what her eyes might reveal if she met his gaze. "You never married," she said, a statement rather than a question. "Never found the right woman." His voice was carefully neutral. "Or perhaps I was too busy building the ranch to notice if she crossed my path. And now I think perhaps I've been blind to what's been right in front of me." Dell's heart beat faster at his words, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Mrs. Peterson would make someone a fine wife," she said lightly, though she might object to the age difference. Quincy's laugh broke the tension. "Mrs. Peterson would box my ears for such an impertinent suggestion. And then poison my coffee for good measure." Dell smiled, relieved that the moment of intensity had passed. "She is rather protective of you. She's been with me since the beginning. Answered my advertisement for a housekeeper when all I could offer was poor wages and poorer accommodations. Said she was tired of town life and wanted the quiet of the country." His expression grew fond. "She's more mother to me than employee, truth be told. You're fortunate to have her." "I'm fortunate in many ways," Quincy agreed, his eyes holding her steadily. "More so in recent months." Before Dell could respond to this veiled reference to her presence, a commotion outside interrupted them, the sound of horses arriving at a gallop and men shouting. Quincy was on his feet instantly, reaching for the rifle he kept beside his bed. "Stay here," he ordered, moving toward the window to peer out into the darkness. "What is it?" Dell asked, fear clutching at her throat. "Trouble," Quincy replied grimly. "Someone's riding in hard and it's too late for social calls." He strode from the room and Dell followed despite his instruction to stay behind. In the main hallway, they encountered Tom Bradley, shotgun in hand, "It's Evans," Bradley reported tersely. "Says the Taylors hit the Peterson place, burned them out," Quincy swore under his breath. Casualties. "Old man Peterson's dead, rest of the family made it out," Dell gasped in horror. The Petersons were good people, a family with 3 young children who farmed several miles to the east. "Where are they now?" Quincy demanded. Evans took the women and children to the Jackson place. "The men are gathering, they're calling for a posse." Quincy nodded decisively. "Saddle my horse and wake the rest of the men. The Taylors have gone too far this time." "Quincy, no," Dell protested, catching his arm. "Your shoulder hasn't fully healed, and vigilante justice isn't the answer." "What would you have me do, Dell? Wait for Sheriff Wilson to sober up enough to investigate. By then the Taylors will be in the next county, or worse, attacking another homestead." "Then go for the sheriff first," she pleaded. "Form an official posse, don't put yourself outside the law." Quincy's expression softened slightly at her concern. "I'll send Richards to town for the sheriff, but I won't sit idle while those murderers roam free," he turned to Bradley. 10 minutes, have the men ready to ride." As Bradley hurried to comply, Quincy returned to his room for his coat and gun belt. Dell followed, desperate to make him see reason. "At least wait until morning," she urged. "Tracking in the dark is dangerous and the Taylors will be expecting pursuit." "Which is why we must go now while they think they're safe." Quincy checked his revolver methodically. "I've crossed paths with Wade Taylor before. He's cunning and ruthless, but he's also arrogant. He'll expect us to wait for daylight." Dell recognized the determination in his voice and knew further argument would be futile. "Then promise me you'll be careful. Don't take unnecessary risks." Quincy paused in his preparations, turning to face her fully. For a long moment he simply looked at her, as if memorizing her features. "I'll be careful," he said finally. "I have reason to be." Before Dell could respond, he closed the distance between them and with gentle deliberation brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was brief, questioning, a promise of possibilities rather than a demand. "That's for luck," he murmured as he drew back, "and for something to come back to." Then he was gone, leaving Dell standing in his room, fingers pressed to lips that still tingled from his touch. The night that followed was the longest of Dell's life. She and Mrs. Peterson sat in the kitchen, keeping the coffee pot hot and preparing food for the men's return. Neither spoke much, each lost in her own anxious thoughts. "He'll be all right," Mrs. Peterson said finally, breaking a silence that had stretched for over an hour. "Quincy knows how to handle himself." "The Taylors killed Mr. Peterson," Dell replied, unable to keep the fear from her voice. "They won't hesitate to kill again." "Which is precisely why they must be stopped," the older woman said firmly. "Quincy understands the risks, but he also understands his responsibility to this community. It's why he's respected, why men follow him." Dell nodded, acknowledging the truth of this. In the months she had been at the Double G, she had seen how the neighboring farmers and ranchers looked to Quincy for leadership. He was fair, reliable, and possessed a natural authority that drew others to him. "He cares for you, you know," Mrs. Peterson continued, her shrewd eyes assessing Dell's reaction. "More than I've ever seen him care for any woman." Dell felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's been kind to me, as he would be to anyone in need." Mrs. Peterson snorted. "Girl, I've known that man for 10 years. He doesn't read poetry with anyone in need, nor does he spend every evening on the porch watching the sunset with hired help. He values you, and not just for your skill with bread dough and garden plants." Dell didn't know how to respond. The kiss they had shared before Quincy's departure had awakened hopes she scarcely dared acknowledge. "If you care for him too, don't waste time with pride or uncertainty," Mrs. Peterson advised. "Life's too short and too precious out here to squander chances for happiness." Before Dell could reply, the distant sound of hoofbeats jolted them both to attention. They rushed to the porch, straining to see in the pre-dawn light. A group of riders approached slowly, and Dell's heart constricted with fear at the deliberate pace. As they drew nearer, she could make out Quincy at the lead. Relief flooded her at the sight of him upright in the saddle, apparently unharmed. Behind him rode his men, and in the middle of the group, 3 bound figures slumped on their horses, captives, not casualties. They've taken prisoners, Mrs. Peterson observed. That's good, means they'll stand trial proper instead of swinging from the nearest tree. The riders reached the house and Quincy dismounted wearily. His face was smudged with dirt and what looked like blood, but he moved without obvious injury. Mrs. Peterson, Dell, he greeted them. Coffee would be welcome. It's been a long night. Are you hurt? Dell asked, searching his face anxiously. Nothing serious. A few scratches in the scuffle. He nodded toward the prisoners. We caught up with the Taylors at their camp. They didn't expect us so soon after the raid. All three of them, Mrs. Peterson asked, eyeing the captives with undisguised contempt. Wade, Lyle, and Jeb Taylor, Quincy confirmed. The whole gang. Sheriff Wilson is meeting us here to take them into custody. They'll stand trial for murder and arson, among other charges. Dell felt weak with relief. No one else was hurt. Miller took a bullet in the arm, but Doc Evans is seeing to him. We were lucky. Quincy's gaze softened as it rested on her. Very lucky. Come inside, Dell said. You need food and rest before the sheriff arrives, while Mrs. Peterson organized coffee and breakfast for the returning men. Dell insisted on examining Quincy for injuries. He had indeed escaped with only minor cuts and bruises, though exhaustion was evident in every line of his body. You need sleep, she told him as she cleaned a shallow cut on his cheek. Later, he promised. After the Taylors are safely in custody. They fell silent as she continued her ministrations, the events of the night and that brief kiss before his departure hanging between them, unaddressed but impossible to ignore. Dell, Quincy began finally, capturing her hand as she finished tending his injuries. What I did before I left, you don't need to explain, she interrupted, suddenly afraid of what he might say. It was the heat of the moment, I understand. No, you don't, he said firmly. It wasn't impulsive or unconsidered. I've wanted to kiss you for weeks. Dell's breath caught. Quincy, let me finish, please. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. I'm not a man given to hasty declarations or fleeting emotions. What I feel for you has grown steadily since the day you arrived at the Double G, wet and desperate but still proud, still determined to stand on your own feet. He released her hand and rose, pacing the small confines of the kitchen as if unable to remain still. I admired your courage then. I've come to admire much more since your kindness, your intelligence, your quiet strength, the way you've made this house feel more like a home than it ever has. Dell stood frozen, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing. I know it hasn't been long, Quincy continued, and I know there are matters still unresolved between us, your land, your future plans. But last night, facing the Taylors, knowing any moment could be my last, I realized I couldn't bear the thought of dying without telling you how I feel. He stopped his pacing and faced her directly. I love you, Delilah Ellis. I think I have from that first night when you sat at my table and refused to be broken by all you had lost. Tears sprang to Dell's eyes at the simple, heartfelt declaration. Quincy, a commotion outside interrupted her response. The sheriff had arrived with his deputies to take custody of the Taylors. Frustration flashed across Quincy's face at the untimely interruption. We'll continue this conversation later, he promised, his eyes conveying what words could not in that moment. After my business with the sheriff is concluded, Dell nodded, though she ached to respond to his declaration immediately. I'll be here. The transfer of the prisoners to the sheriff's custody took longer than anticipated. Statements had to be taken from all who had participated in the capture, and Sheriff Wilson, a methodical man despite his reputation for fondness for whiskey, insisted on thorough documentation. By the time the lawman and his charges departed, it was mid-afternoon, and Quincy was swaying on his feet with exhaustion. Dell insisted he rest, and for once he didn't argue. He fell asleep almost instantly and remained so well into the evening. Dell used the time to think, to examine her own heart. She had come to the Double G broken and desperate, her future uncertain. Quincy had offered her not just shelter but respect, treating her as an equal rather than an object of pity. Over the months, she had come to admire his quiet strength, his unwavering sense of duty, his fundamental decency. Admiration had deepened to affection, and affection to love, though she had tried to deny it even to herself. But could she truly build a life here at the Double G? Would she always feel like an outsider, a flood victim taken in out of charity? And what of her own dreams, her desire for independence? As twilight fell, Dell made her way to the garden she had tended so carefully. The spring plantings were flourishing rows of corn reaching toward the sky, tomato vines heavy with green fruit, beans climbing their poles with vigorous determination. She had created this abundance, nurtured it from seed to harvest. It gave her a sense of accomplishment, of belonging. She was still there, lost in thought, when Quincy found her. "Mrs. Peterson said you might be here," he said, his voice gentle in the gathering dusk. Dell turned to face him. He looked rested, the lines of fatigue erased from his face. "How do you feel?" "Better. Though I find I'm anxious about a conversation left unfinished this morning." Dell smiled despite her nervousness. "As am I." Quincy stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "You were about to respond to my rather inelegant declaration when we were interrupted." "It wasn't inelegant," Dell protested. "It was honest, beautiful even." Hope flickered in his eyes. "And your response?" Dell took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "My response is that I love you too, Quincy Galloway. I've tried not to. Told myself it was gratitude or infatuation or simple loneliness, but it's none of those things. It's deeper, truer." Joy transformed Quincy's face, erasing the last vestiges of weariness. "Dell," he breathed, reaching for her. She stepped willingly into his embrace, her arms encircling his waist as his wrapped around her shoulders. For a long moment, they simply held each other, savoring the rightness of the connection. "I never expected this," Dell murmured against his chest. "When the flood took everything, I thought my life was over. I couldn't see a path forward." "And now?" Quincy asked, drawing back slightly to see her face. "Now I see possibilities I never imagined. But Quincy, there are practical matters we must consider. I won't be dependent even on someone I love. I need purpose, work of my own." Quincy nodded, his expression serious. "I would never ask you to be less than who you are. The Double G needs a strong woman's hand in the house, yes, but also in the management of the ranch itself. I've seen your capabilities, your intelligence. You would be my partner in every sense, not my dependent." "And my land?" Dell asked, remembering his offer to purchase it. "Still yours to decide about. If you wish to sell it to me, I'll pay fair market value. If you wish to keep it as your own investment, I'll respect that too. What matters is that you're happy, that you feel secure in your choices." His words eased the last of Dell's doubts. This was a man who understood her need for autonomy, who valued her for her strength rather than despite it. "In that case, Mr. Galloway," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her, "I find your proposition acceptable." Quincy's eyebrows rose. "Proposition? I don't recall making one, Miss Ellis." Dell laughed, suddenly lighthearted. "Perhaps you should remedy that oversight." With a smile that took her breath away, Quincy took her hands in his. "Delilah Ellis, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of making the Double G your home, officially and permanently? Of building a future with me that's stronger and more beautiful than either of us could create alone?" "Yes," Dell answered without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." Quincy's kiss was gentle at first, a sealing of promises, then deeper as years of solitude and longing gave way to the joy of found love. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "Mrs. Peterson will be insufferably pleased with herself," Quincy murmured, pressing his forehead to Dell's. "She's been hinting for weeks that I should declare myself to you. She mentioned something similar to me this morning," Dell admitted with a laugh. "I believe her exact words were that life is too short to squander chances for happiness." "Wise woman," Quincy said. "We should tell her first, before the hands start gossiping." Hand in hand, they walked back to the house, where Mrs. Peterson received their news with a satisfaction that suggested she had expected nothing less. "About time," she declared, wiping away suspicious moisture from her eyes. "I was beginning to think I'd need to lock you both in the root cellar until you came to your senses." The wedding took place in July, a simple ceremony in the Douglas Church, followed by a celebration at the Double G that brought together the entire community. Dell wore a gown of ivory silk ordered from Denver, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Quincy, resplendent in a new suit, watched her walk toward him with an expression of such naked adoration that several of the attending ladies dabbed at their eyes. As summer turned to fall and fall to winter, the Double G prospered under its new mistress's care. Dell used the money from the sale of her flood-damaged property to establish a small lending library in Douglas, ensuring that other young women would have access to the education she had valued so highly. The house expanded to accommodate her growing collection of books, and the garden flourished beyond even Mrs. Peterson's ambitious expectations. By spring, there was another expansion to plan for, as Dell's gently rounding figure announced the coming of the next generation of Galloways. Quincy's joy at the news was boundless, his protectiveness both touching and occasionally frustrating to his independent wife. "I'm with child not made of glass," she reminded him when he attempted to prevent her from tending her beloved garden. "Humor me," he would reply, stealing a kiss that invariably distracted her from her irritation. "It's my first time at this." Their son, James Thomas Galloway, was born on a crisp October morning, his lusty cries announcing his arrival to the anxious father pacing outside the bedroom door. When Quincy was finally allowed in to see his wife and child, the expression on his face was one Dell would treasure for all her day's wonder and love and fierce protectiveness, all mingled into a look of pure devotion. "He's perfect," Quincy whispered, one finger gently stroking the downy head nestled against Dell's breast. "Like his mother. He has your eyes," Dell observed, though in truth it was too early to tell, "and your stubborn chin." Quincy laughed softly. "Poor child to inherit that from me. Let us hope he gets your patience and good sense to balance it." As the years passed, James was joined by a sister, Margaret, and later by another brother, William. The Double G expanded its operations, becoming one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Dell's library grew into a proper school, where she occasionally taught when the demands of ranch life and motherhood permitted. Through it all the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and challenges of frontier life, Quincy and Dell remained steadfast in their devotion to each other. The flood that had once threatened to destroy Dell's life had instead swept her toward the greatest happiness she could have imagined, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to unexpected blessings. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Quincy presented Dell with a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his neat handwriting. "What's this?" she asked, tracing the embossed cover with wondering fingers. "Our story," Quincy replied simply. "I started writing it down for the children, so they would know how their mother's courage in the face of disaster brought her to the Double G, and how her presence transformed a house into a home." Dell opened the journal, tears filling her eyes as she read the first lines. "The flood took her bread and her hope. I said she would eat at my table that night. Neither of us knew then that she would sit at that table for all the nights to come, filling it with laughter and love, and the kind of abundance that can't be measured in acres or cattle, but only in the fullness of the heart." "It's beautiful," she whispered, looking up at the man who had become the center of her world. "Thank you for writing this down, for remembering." "How could I forget?" Quincy asked, gathering her close. "It was the beginning of everything that matters." Outside, the setting sun painted the Colorado sky in shades of gold and crimson, illuminating the prosperous ranch they had built together, a testament to what could rise from the ruins of disaster when hope and love showed the way forward.